Chapter 1. The grave you dig may be your own. July 2004. Tanner clamped one hand over the mouth of Truman Smith as his other hand was busy stabbing Smith in the back. Truman had just picked the lock on a rear door that led into an apartment building in Lower Manhattan. Once inside, Truman would have taken the back staircase to the third-floor residence of a young woman named Tanya Aronson. When Truman left the apartment, Miss Aronson would have been dead or injured. Truman Smith had raped Tanya days earlier. During the struggle, Tanya had torn the ski mask from Truman's face. Later, she picked him out of a lineup. The marks her nails left on his cheek were still red and swollen beneath his mop of shaggy brown hair. Truman's lawyer argued successfully that the lineup was unfair to his client because the other men bore no marks on their faces. A judge agreed, and the rapist was placed back on the streets. One of Truman's earlier victims was seated in court that day. She was the 17-year-old daughter of a lawyer connected to the mob. Although the girl had never seen Truman's face during her attack, she had heard his voice as he taunted her and called her vile names. She would never forget that voice, and had heard it again when Truman had spoken in court. That was when Tanner was called in to administer real justice. He tracked Truman down at his apartment in the afternoon, then became curious about the man's movements. He had watched Truman steal a van from the garage of a home where newspapers were piled up on the doorstep. The van's owner was off somewhere, likely on a vacation, and had forgotten to cancel his newspaper delivery. It was safe to assume the van's absence wouldn't be noticed right away. Tanner wondered why Truman would need to steal a van and decided to watch him for a while. On a trip to a warehouse store that sold hardware and lumber, Truman purchased a shovel, duct tape, and heavy plastic sheeting, along with 6 bottles of a drain cleaner that contained high levels of lye. Tanner didn't think Truman planned to take up gardening, even if it was summer. However, he was certain the rapist intended to plant something, or rather someone. Tanya Aronson, the sole eyewitness against him, would have been that unfortunate someone. Truman's struggling grew weaker by the time Tanner had driven the knife into his back for a 5th time. The van was near the rear door of the apartment house and was parked in the alley with its sliding side door sitting open. Tanner dragged Truman's moaning form over to it and dumped him onto the plastic which Truman had earlier spread out on the floor of the van. Pre-cut lengths of duct tape were attached by one end to the van's sidewall. Tanner used them to bind Truman and placed the final strip over his mouth. As their eyes met in the weak light given off by the single bulb lighting the alley, Tanner saw the amazement in Truman's eyes. The man realized he was being treated the way he'd intended to handle his victim. Tanner shut the door in Truman's face and walked around to climb behind the wheel of the van. He intended to give Truman the fate he'd planned for Tanya Aronson. After leaving the hardware store earlier, Tanner had followed Truman to a row of 2-story homes destined to be demolished by the city. A fire had broken out 4 months earlier due to a faulty toaster oven. By the time the fire department got control of the blaze, flames had swept through 6 row homes. No one had died in the fire since most of the residents were at work, but the families had been displaced. Behind one of those homes, Truman had dug a shallow grave using the shovel he'd purchased less than an hour earlier. The grave had been intended for his victim. Tanner found it more fitting that Truman fill it instead. Although he was still alive when Tanner dragged him from the back of the van, Truman was only minutes from death. He was bleeding internally and suffering from the pain of his wounds. He was still aware enough to realize where he was. Seeing the shallow grave birthed terror in the rapist's eyes. Tanner granted Truman mercy he wasn't sure the man would have given to Tanya Aronson. He made certain that Truman was dead before trundling him into the hole and filling it in. Afterward, Tanner drove the van toward Midtown, his work completed, the contract fulfilled.